Hiker thought it was just a small cave, until he saw what was inside. The rain came down like bullets against the rocky mountainside, each drop exploding into mist as it hit the granite face of the Colorado Rockies. Eli Turner pulled his hood tighter around his face and cursed under his breath. 3 days into what was supposed to be a peaceful solo hiking trip, and Mother Nature seemed determined to wash him right off the mountain. At 29, Eli had thought he'd seen enough storms, both literal and metaphorical, to handle anything. 6 months ago, he'd been pulling 16-hour days as a nature photographer for Wilderness magazine, chasing deadlines and fighting editors who wanted more dramatic shots of pristine landscapes. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent so much time capturing nature's beauty that he'd forgotten how to actually experience it. That's what brought him here, deep into the backcountry with nothing but his camera, a worn backpack, and a desperate need to remember why he'd fallen in love with the outdoors in the first place. But right now, with lightning splitting the sky and thunder rolling through the valleys like an angry god's bowling ball, he was questioning every life choice that had led to this moment. The trail, if you could even call the barely visible deer path he'd been following a trail, had disappeared entirely under the deluge. Eli squinted through the sheets of rain, looking for any kind of shelter. His waterproof jacket was holding up, but his boots were already squelching with every step, and he could feel the cold seeping through his supposedly moisture-wicking base layer. A flash of lightning illuminated the mountainside, and for a split second, Eli caught sight of something that didn't belong. There, about 50 yards to his left, partially hidden behind a curtain of wild vines and mountain vegetation, was what looked like a dark opening in the rock face. "Please don't be a bear den," he muttered, making his way carefully across the slippery rocks toward what he hoped would be salvation from the storm. As he got closer, Eli could see it was definitely a cave, or at least a substantial crack in the mountain. The opening was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide and just tall enough for him to duck inside without scraping his head. Thick vines hung down like nature's own curtain, heavy with rainwater that dripped steadily onto the rocky ground below. He pushed the vegetation aside and peered into the darkness. The cave seemed to extend back further than he'd expected, disappearing into shadows that his eyes couldn't penetrate. A cool, dry breeze drifted out from the depths, carrying with it the musty smell of undisturbed earth and something else, something that reminded him of old attics and forgotten storage rooms. Thunder cracked overhead, so close that Eli felt it in his chest. That decided it. Bear or no bear, he was getting out of this storm. He slipped through the opening, immediately grateful for the absence of rain hammering against his skull. The cave was surprisingly spacious once he got past the narrow entrance. The ceiling rose to about 8 feet, and the walls stretched back into darkness on either side. Eli pulled out his headlamp and clicked it on, the LED beam cutting through the gloom like a white-hot knife. What he saw made him freeze. This wasn't just a natural cave. About 15 feet back from the entrance, the rough rock walls gave way to something clearly man-made, smooth stone blocks fitted together with the precision of skilled masonry. Someone had turned this natural shelter into a storage space, and from the look of things, they'd done it recently enough that everything wasn't covered in decades of dust and debris. Eli's photographer instincts kicked in. This was interesting. This was the kind of discovery that could make for a great story, maybe even a photo essay. He moved deeper into the cave, his headlamp beam dancing across the walls and floor. The constructed alcove was about the size of a small bedroom, carved into the living rock with impressive skill. Along one wall, someone had built stone shelves, and on those shelves sat an assortment of items that made Eli's curiosity spike even higher. There were hiking boots, still in decent condition despite being covered in a fine layer of dust. A sleeping bag, rolled up and secured with paracord. Several water bottles, empty but clean. A camping stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years but was well maintained. And books, actual physical books, wrapped in plastic bags to protect them from moisture. But it was the large, waterproof container sitting on the highest shelf that really caught his attention. It was the kind of heavy-duty case that serious outdoorsmen used to protect valuable equipment, sealed tight enough to keep out moisture, dust, and curious animals. Eli set his backpack down and looked around the cave more carefully. Everything here suggested long-term planning, not just a temporary shelter. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating a secret hideaway, stocked with supplies and protected from the elements. But why? And where was whoever had built this place? The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the thunder was getting more frequent, and Eli could hear what sounded like hail beginning to mix with the rain. He might be stuck here for hours. He looked back at the waterproof container. It was clearly meant to protect something important, something valuable enough to warrant all this secrecy and preparation. His journalistic instincts were screaming at him to investigate, but his rational mind was urging caution. This was someone else's property, someone else's secrets. Another crack of thunder, so loud it seemed to shake the entire mountain, made the decision for him. He was trapped here anyway, and whoever had created this place was clearly long gone. What harm could there be in satisfying his curiosity? Eli climbed up onto one of the lower stone shelves and carefully lifted the container down. It was heavier than he'd expected, and he could hear things shifting around inside as he set it on the cave floor. The latches were still tight, the seals intact. Whatever was inside had been protected from years of mountain weather. He opened the case. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and cloth, were 3 leather-bound journals. They looked old but well-preserved, the kind of quality leather goods that only got better with age. Beneath the journals was a manila envelope, and tucked into the corner of the case was a small plastic bag containing what looked like personal effects. Eli pulled out the plastic bag first. Inside was a wallet, a set of keys, and a cell phone that was clearly several years old. He opened the wallet carefully, half expecting it to fall apart in his hands. The driver's license was still clearly readable, protected by the plastic sleeve. The photo showed a young man with dark hair and serious eyes, someone who looked like he might be in his mid-20s. But it was the name that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. Caleb Andrus. Eli stared at the license, his mind racing. That name was familiar, incredibly familiar, but he couldn't immediately place why. He looked at the expiration date. The license had expired 8 years ago. The address was listed as Denver, Colorado, but that didn't help him remember where he'd heard the name before. He set the wallet aside and picked up one of the journals. The leather was soft and well-worn, clearly handled frequently by someone who cared about it. He opened to the first page, where neat handwriting in black ink had recorded a date from 10 years ago. Day 1 in my new home. The entry began. If you can call a cave in the middle of nowhere a home. But it's better than the alternative. It's better than facing what I'd have to face if I went back. Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This wasn't just some abandoned camping gear. This was someone's refuge, someone's hiding place. And whoever Caleb Andrus was, he'd been running from something serious enough to make him disappear into the wilderness completely. He flipped through a few more pages, seeing entries that spanned months, then years. The handwriting remained consistent, but the tone seemed to shift from entry to entry, sometimes hopeful, sometimes desperate, always carrying an undercurrent of fear and regret. Thunder rolled overhead again, but Eli barely noticed. He was holding something far more powerful than any storm. He was holding someone's entire hidden life, preserved in leather and ink and tucked away where no one was ever meant to find it. The name Caleb Andrus was still nagging at him, hovering just at the edge of his memory like a word on the tip of his tongue. He pulled out his phone, hoping to get enough signal to do a quick internet search, but the screen showed no bars. The storm was probably interfering with the cell towers, and besides, he was deep enough in the mountains that service would be spotty even on a clear day. He looked back at the journal in his hands. Whatever story these pages contained, whatever had driven Caleb Andrus to disappear into the Colorado wilderness, it was all right here waiting to be discovered. And given the care with which everything had been preserved and hidden, it was clearly a story that someone, maybe Caleb himself, maybe someone else, had very much wanted to keep secret. The rain continued to pound against the mountain outside, but inside the cave, Eli Turner had found something far more intriguing than shelter from the storm. He'd found a mystery that was about to change everything. The storm raged for 3 more days. 3 days of reading by flickering firelight, while rain hammered the mountain and wind howled through the canyon below. 3 days that changed everything Eli thought he knew about justice, family, and the price of truth. He made camp just inside the cave entrance, far enough back to stay dry but close enough to the opening to let the smoke from his small fire escape. The journals lay spread around him like pieces of a puzzle, their secrets spilling out with each turned page. Caleb Andrus had been running from more than just bad weather. The first journal started simply enough: complaints about sleeping on stone, observations about mountain wildlife, basic survival notes. But by the second week of entries, the real story began to emerge, and Eli found himself holding his breath as he read. "Miles called again today," one entry read. "Left another voicemail saying he can fix this if I just come home." Fix this? He's the one who broke it. He's the one who used my access codes, my digital signature, my trust fund account numbers. And now he wants to fix it by making me the fall guy. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. Miles Andrus. Now he remembered where he'd heard that name. Miles Andrus, the tech billionaire who'd built a software empire before the age of 30. The man whose company had revolutionized cloud storage and made him one of the richest people in America. But there had been a scandal, hadn't there? Something about financial irregularities, missing money, regulatory investigations. Eli tried to remember the details, but it had been years ago, and he'd been more focused on his photography career than business news at the time. I should have seen it coming. Another entry continued several pages later. The way he kept asking about my trust fund access, about the inheritance procedures from Dad's estate. I thought he was just being helpful, just making sure I understood the family finances. I never imagined he was planning to use my identity to hide $2 billion in stolen tech patents and contracts. $2 billion. Eli sat back against the cave wall, the journal heavy in his hands. This wasn't just family drama or business disagreements. If what Caleb was writing was true, his brother had committed massive fraud and somehow made it look like Caleb was responsible. He flipped ahead, looking for more details, and found pages covered with what looked like financial calculations, account numbers, and detailed timelines. Caleb had been methodical in documenting everything: dates, times, amounts, the names of companies and officials involved. The worst part isn't even the money. One particularly heartbreaking entry read. It's knowing that Miles looked me in the eye for months, knowing what he was planning. Every family dinner, every conversation about our company's future, every time he called me his trusted little brother, he was already planning to destroy my life to save his own. Eli found himself getting angry on behalf of someone he'd never met. The picture emerging from these pages was of a young man who'd been systematically betrayed by the person he trusted most in the world. But it was also the picture of someone who'd been too naive to see it coming until it was too late. The second journal picked up the story after Caleb had fled to the mountains. The entries became more survival-focused but also more philosophical, more introspective. Caleb wrote about learning to hunt and fish, about building this cave hideaway, about the strange peace that came with living completely off the grid. But he also wrote about the crushing loneliness and the weight of carrying a truth that no one would ever believe. Who's going to take the word of a disgraced embezzler over Miles Andrus, tech visionary and philanthropist? One entry asked. I've watched the news coverage. I know how the story looks from the outside. Troubled younger brother, history of drug problems in college, access to family money and company accounts. Miles played it perfectly. Even if I came forward with everything I know, people would just think I was a desperate criminal trying to shift blame. But it was the third journal that hit Eli like a physical blow. This one was different, more organized, more purposeful. Caleb had been planning something. I've been thinking about Dad's old mining claims. One entry began. The ones he never told anyone about, not even Miles. Found the papers in Mom's things after the funeral, but I never thought much about them at the time. Now I'm wondering if maybe Dad left me something more valuable than either of us realized. Page after page detailed Caleb's research into their father's past, his discovery of legitimate gold mining claims in Colorado that had never been properly surveyed or reported to the officials. Claims that, according to Caleb's calculations, could be worth tens of millions of dollars if the geological surveys he'd commissioned were accurate. The irony is perfect. Caleb had written, "Miles stole my money and my reputation, but he never knew about Dad's secret legacy. If I can prove these claims are valid, I'll have my own fortune, one he can't touch, can't steal, can't use against me." But the most chilling entry came near the end of the third journal. "I've been out here 4 years now. 4 years of watching the world move on without me, of seeing Miles get richer and more powerful while I live like a ghost in the mountains. I've documented everything, proven everything, even found Dad's gold. But I'm starting to realize something terrible. I don't think I can ever go back. Not because I'm guilty, but because I'm not brave enough to fight him anymore. He didn't just steal my money. He stole my life, my confidence, my ability to trust anyone ever again. Maybe that was the real plan all along." Eli closed the journal and stared into the dying embers of his fire. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken, but inside his head, a different kind of storm was raging. He was holding evidence of what could be one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in recent history, along with documentation of a legitimate mining fortune that could change his own life forever. But more than that, he was holding the last words of a man who'd been so broken by betrayal that he'd chosen to disappear rather than fight for his own innocence. The question now was what to do about it. Caleb Andrus had been too afraid to seek justice for himself, but did that mean justice should never come? Miles Andrus was still out there, still rich and powerful, still benefiting from his brother's suffering. And somewhere in these mountains was a fortune in gold that belonged to a man who might never come back to claim it. Eli picked up his camera and photographed several key pages from the journals, making sure the evidence would be preserved even if something happened to the originals. Then he carefully wrapped everything back up and sealed it in the waterproof container. Tomorrow, when the storm cleared, he would have to decide: walk away and pretend he never found any of this, or step into a fight that had already destroyed one man's life completely. He added another log to the fire and settled in for one more night of difficult questions and impossible choices. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm finally spent after 3 days of fury. Eli stood at the cave entrance, breathing crisp mountain air that tasted of snow and pine, the journals tucked safely in his backpack alongside his camera equipment. He made his decision somewhere in the dark hours before sunrise. He couldn't walk away from this. But he also couldn't go to the authorities with nothing but century-old mining claims and the desperate writings of a man who'd vanished 10 years ago. If he was going to honor Caleb's truth, he needed proof. Real, tangible evidence that would make people listen. The hand-drawn maps in Caleb's journals were surprisingly detailed. Years of living in these mountains had taught the younger Andrus brother every ridge, every stream, every landmark for miles around. His sketches showed a careful progression from the cave hideout to various locations where he'd hidden supplies, conducted geological surveys, and eventually found what their father had left behind. Eli's first stop was a marked spot about 2 miles downstream, where Caleb had written about finding Dad's first marker. The journal entry was cryptic but specific. 3 stones stacked like a pyramid, pointing toward the old mining road. Dad was more clever than any of us realized. The hike down to the riverbank took Eli through terrain that Caleb had described in loving detail. Every fallen log, every distinctive rock formation matched the journal entries perfectly. This wasn't the work of someone making things up. This was the careful documentation of someone who'd lived every step of this journey. He found the 3 stones exactly where Caleb had indicated, weathered but still standing after decades of mountain weather. They were arranged in a perfect triangle pointing northwest, toward what must have been the old mining road mentioned in the journals. But it was what lay beneath the stones that made Eli's pulse quicken. Wrapped in heavy plastic and buried just deep enough to protect it from animals was a metal ammunition box. Inside, Eli found copies of their father's original mining documents, geological survey reports that looked professionally done, and a smaller leather pouch containing something that made his hands shake. Gold nuggets. Real gold, gleaming even in the filtered mountain sunlight. The accompanying note, written in Caleb's careful handwriting, explained everything. Dad's preliminary survey, 1987. Estimated yield, 3 to 5 tons of recoverable gold from claims #47-52. He never filed these claims officially, wanted to keep them secret until he could afford proper extraction equipment. By the time he died, Miles and I were both too busy with the tech company to pay attention to his old mountain stories. I should have listened. Eli photographed everything, his photographer's eye automatically framing the shots for maximum impact. But this wasn't about getting the perfect picture anymore. This was about documenting proof that would hold up under scrutiny. The second location took him deeper into the mountains, following a trail that existed more in Caleb's memory than on any official map. Here, beside a stream that fed into the larger river system, Caleb had established his main survey camp. The remains were still there: fire rings, tent platforms built from flat stones, and carefully cached supplies that spoke to months of methodical work. But it was the third cache that truly took Eli's breath away. Hidden beneath what looked like a natural rock slide, Caleb had built a sophisticated storage system. Metal boxes buried deep enough to protect them from weather and wildlife, each one sealed and labeled with the precision of someone who understood the value of what he was protecting. Inside the largest cache, Eli found geological reports that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars to commission. Core samples, mineral analysis, detailed maps showing the full extent of their father's claims. Everything needed to prove that the Andrus family had legitimate claim to what could be one of the richest undeveloped gold deposits in Colorado. But there was more. Much more. Caleb had been methodical about everything, including documenting his brother's crimes. The cache contained copies of electronic records, financial documents, even audio recordings that Caleb had somehow obtained before fleeing. Miles Andrus hadn't just stolen money. He'd systematically built an empire on technologies and patents that belonged to other people, using his brother's identity to hide the paper trail. As Eli sorted through the evidence, he began to understand the true scope of what Caleb had discovered. This wasn't just about $2 billion in fraud. This was about a pattern of theft and deception that went back years, involving dozens of companies and contracts. Miles Andrus hadn't just destroyed his brother's life, he'd built his entire fortune on lies. The final cache was different from the others. Smaller, more personal, hidden in a place that required rail climbing to reach. Inside, Eli found something that broke his heart: letters that Caleb had written but never sent. Letters to his brother, begging for an explanation. Letters to friends, trying to explain what had really happened. Letters to parents who were already finished, asking for guidance he would never receive. And one letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this. If you're reading this," it began, "then I'm probably finished, or I've finally given up and walked away from everything. Either way, the story needs to be told. My brother destroyed my life, but he also destroyed the lives of countless other people whose work he stole, whose innovations he claimed as his own. The gold is real, the evidence is real, and maybe someone braver than me can use it to set things right." Eli sat on a boulder beside the mountain stream, the letter heavy in his hands, and felt the full weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Caleb Andrus had spent years gathering the evidence to destroy one of the most powerful men in America. Evidence that could restore his own reputation and reveal a fortune that rightfully belonged to him. But Caleb had been too broken, too afraid, too alone to use it. Now it was up to Eli to decide what came next. He had proof of everything: the fraud, the gold, the systematic destruction of an innocent man's life. He had enough evidence to bring down a billionaire, and enough treasure to change his own life forever. The question was whether he had the courage to use it. The drive back to civilization felt like traveling between two different worlds. Behind him lay the mountains, where truth was carved into stone and preserved in hidden caches. Ahead lay a world where money and power could rewrite reality itself, where a man like Miles Andrus could destroy his own brother and call it business. Eli's truck bumped along the dirt logging road, the waterproof case containing Caleb's evidence secured in the passenger's seat like a sleeping bomb. Every mile brought him closer to a decision that would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone whose lives had been touched by the Andrus family's tragedy. His first stop was the Granby County Historical Society, a modest building that looked more like someone's house than an official repository of local history. The elderly woman behind the desk, Martha Hendricks, had the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd seen every kind of treasure hunter and conspiracy theorist the mountains could produce. "Mining claims from the 1980s?" she repeated, adjusting her glasses as she examined the documents Eli had photographed. "Well, that's unusual. Most people come in here looking for gold rush-era claims from the 1860s. But as Martha studied the papers more closely, her expression changed. She pulled out magnifying glasses, cross-referenced claim numbers in thick ledgers, and made several phone calls to colleagues at the county courthouse. "These are legitimate," she finally announced, her voice carrying a note of amazement. "Robert Andrus filed preliminary claims on these sections in 1987, but he never completed the full registration process. According to our records, he died in 1995, which means these claims would have passed to his heirs. His sons," Eli said carefully. "Miles and Caleb Andrus." Martha nodded, then paused. "Caleb Andrus, that name rings a bell. Wasn't he involved in some kind of financial scandal years ago? That's what the newspapers said." Martha pulled out a different set of files. "You know, if these claims were properly filed and the geological surveys are accurate, we're talking about significant value. I mean, really significant. The kind of find that could set a family up for generations." She leaned across the desk, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, young man, there's been some interest in this area lately. A development company has been asking questions about mineral rights in these exact sections. Big money from back east, very hush-hush. They seemed disappointed when I told them the land was already claimed." Eli felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of development company?" "Something called Mountain Vista Holdings. Fancy lawyers, expensive suits, the kind of people who make you feel like your little historical society isn't quite important enough for their time." Martha's expression hardened. "They offered to buy any documentation we had about unclaimed mineral rights in the area. Offered quite a lot, actually." The pieces clicked into place in Eli's mind with sickening clarity. Miles Andrus wasn't just content with stealing his brother's reputation and money, he was trying to steal their father's legacy too. The development company was probably one of his shell corporations, quietly attempting to claim land that rightfully belonged to Caleb. That evening, in his motel room in the small mountain town of Fraser, Eli spread everything out on the bed. The evidence, the photographs, the mining documents, Caleb's heartbreaking letters. He had enough material to write the story of the decade, maybe the century. But he also had a choice to make. The gold alone could make him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. The mining claims were legitimate, and with Caleb apparently gone, there might be legal ways to claim them himself. A good lawyer could probably argue that abandonment after 10 years constituted forfeiture. Eli could walk away from his struggling photography career and never worry about money again. Or he could sell the story to the highest bidder. Every major news organization would pay millions for exclusive access to evidence that could bring down Miles Andrus. Eli's career would be made overnight, his name forever linked to one of the biggest investigative scoops in modern history. But neither of those options felt right. Eli picked up the newspaper clipping he'd found in one of Caleb's caches, a photo from a charity gala 10 years ago. It showed both Andrus brothers at some kind of medical research fundraiser, Miles in an expensive tuxedo with his arm around Caleb's shoulders. Caleb looked younger, happier, proud to be standing next to his successful big brother. The caption identified them as technology visionary Miles Andrus and his brother Caleb, co-founder of Andrus Innovations. Co-founder. Even in this old newspaper, the truth was there. Caleb hadn't just been some troubled younger brother riding on Miles's coattails. He'd been a partner, a creator, someone whose work had helped build the empire that Miles later used to destroy him. Eli thought about the loneliness in Caleb's journal entries, the desperation in his letters, the careful way he'd hidden evidence that could have saved him if only he'd been brave enough to use it. Caleb Andrus had spent 10 years in exile, believing that no one would ever listen to his side of the story. Maybe it was time to prove him wrong. Eli picked up his phone and dialed directory assistance. "I need the number for Sandra Morrison," he said. "She used to be an investigative journalist for the Washington Post." It was time to stop thinking about what this discovery could do for him, and start thinking about what it could do for the truth. Sandra Morrison's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd spent decades chasing stories that powerful people preferred to keep buried. At 68, she'd been retired from investigative journalism for 5 years, but when Eli mentioned the name Andrus, he could practically hear her sitting up straighter on the other end of the phone. "The Andrus scandal," she said slowly. "I covered that story back in 2015. Always felt like there were pieces missing, loose ends that didn't quite tie up. The younger brother's disappearance was too convenient, too clean. But by the time I started asking the right questions, everyone had moved on to the next big story." 2 days later, Sandra sat across from Eli in a coffee shop in Denver, her weathered hands carefully turning through photocopies of Caleb's journals. Her editor's eye moved quickly across the pages, but he could see her pausing at the most damning entries, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "This is extraordinary," she finally said, looking up from a page detailing Miles's manipulation of contracts. "If even half of this is verifiable, we're looking at the biggest corporate fraud case since Enron. But Eli, you understand what you're walking into, don't you? Miles Andrus has more money than some small countries. He's got legal teams that specialize in destroying people who threaten him. What happened to Caleb proves that," Eli replied. "The question is whether we're going to let him do it again." Sandra smiled grimly. "Spoken like someone who's never been sued by a billionaire. But you're right. Some stories are too important to ignore, regardless of the consequences." Over the next week, Sandra worked her network of contacts with the methodical precision that had made her one of the most respected investigative journalists of her generation. She verified the geological surveys through independent experts, confirmed the legitimacy of the mining claims through county records, and most importantly, found corroborating evidence for many of Caleb's accusations. "The electronic records he copied before he fled," Sandra explained during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "I've had my tech consultant analyze them. They're authentic, and they show a pattern of theft going back almost 15 years. Patents stolen from smaller companies, research appropriated for private use, financial records that prove systematic embezzlement from joint ventures." But it was Sandra's contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission who provided the final piece of the puzzle. "There's been an ongoing investigation into Andrus Innovations for the past 2 years," she told Eli over secure phone. "Insider trading, manipulation of stock prices, misrepresentation of company assets. They've been building a case, but they needed smoking gun evidence. What you've found could be exactly what they're looking for." 3 weeks after their first meeting, Sandra published her articles simultaneously in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. The headline was simple but devastating. "The Lost Brother: How Tech Billionaire Miles Andrus Built His Empire on Lies." The response was immediate and explosive. Within hours, #Andrus Scandal was trending on social media. Stock prices for Andrus Innovations plummeted. Congressional representatives called for immediate investigations. Legal experts appeared on cable news shows to discuss the potential criminal charges. But it was Miles Andrus's response that surprised everyone. Instead of the usual corporate denial and legal threats, Miles released a carefully crafted statement that admitted to financial irregularities, while maintaining that his brother had been a willing participant in all business decisions. He announced his immediate resignation as CEO and his intention to cooperate fully with all investigations. The statement was a masterpiece of damage control, but Sandra wasn't fooled. "He's cutting his losses," she explained to Eli as they watched the news coverage from her apartment. "Admitting to minor charges to avoid major ones, throwing Caleb under the bus one more time to save his own skin. Classic billionaire crisis management." But then something unexpected happened. A package arrived at Eli's motel room with no return address, postmarked from Taos, New Mexico. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines written in handwriting that Eli had come to know very well. "You did what I couldn't. You found the courage I lost. The world knows the truth now, and that's worth more than all the gold in Colorado. But there's one more thing you should know: I never stopped fighting. I just changed battlefields. Thank you for giving me my voice back. C.A." Eli stared at the letter, his hands trembling. Caleb Andrus was alive. Alive and apparently following the news coverage of his vindication from wherever he'd been hiding for the past decade. But there was more. Attached to the letter was a business card for a law firm in Santa Fe, with a handwritten note. "They're expecting your call about the mining claims. Some things are worth coming back for." The phone rang. Sandra's number. "Eli, you need to see the news. Miles Andrus just surrendered himself to federal authorities. And there's something else. His legal team just released a statement saying they've received new evidence that could fundamentally change the nature of the case. Evidence provided by someone with intimate knowledge of the defendant's criminal activities." Eli looked at the letter in his hands, understanding dawning like sunrise over the mountains. Caleb Andrus hadn't just been hiding for 10 years. He'd been preparing for this moment, gathering additional evidence, building an unbreakable case against his brother. And now, with the world finally listening, he was ready to step out of the shadows and reclaim his life. 6 months later, Eli stood at the entrance to the cave where everything had begun, a sealed copy of the Washington Post in his hands. The headline read, "Miles Andrus sentenced to 25 years in federal prison." Below it, in smaller text, "Brother's testimony proves decisive in landmark fraud case." The trial had been a media sensation. Caleb Andrus, emerging from a decade of self-imposed exile, had proven to be a devastating witness against his brother. 10 years of careful documentation, combined with Eli's discovery of the hidden evidence, had built an unbreakable case. Miles's empire had crumbled completely, not just the criminal charges, but civil lawsuits from the dozens of companies and individuals he'd defrauded over the years. But for Eli, the real satisfaction hadn't come from watching a powerful man fall. It had come from watching a broken man reclaim his life. He'd met Caleb in person for the first time 3 months ago, in the law offices in Santa Fe where they'd finalized the mining claim transfers. Caleb looked older than his 45 years, weathered by a decade of mountain living, but there was something in his eyes that the journals had never captured: peace. The kind of deep, unshakable peace that comes from finally telling the truth after years of carrying it alone. "I never expected anyone to find that cave," Caleb had said, shaking Eli's hand with the firm grip of someone who'd spent years working with his hands. "I certainly never expected someone to care enough to do anything about what they found." "Why didn't you come forward yourself?" Eli had asked. "You had all the evidence. You could have brought him down years ago." Caleb had been quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the New Mexico mountains. "Fear," he'd finally admitted. "Not of Miles, exactly, but of having to live in the world again. Of trusting people again. 10 years ago, I was a different person. Softer. More naive. When Miles betrayed me, it didn't just destroy my reputation, it destroyed my ability to believe that anyone would choose truth over convenience. And now I know that some people will. You proved that." The mining claims had indeed been worth a fortune. Geological surveys confirmed deposits worth nearly $40 million. Caleb had insisted on splitting the proceeds with Eli, despite Eli's protests. "You gave me something worth more than money," Caleb had said. "You gave me my life back. This is the least I can do." But Eli had surprised himself by what he did with his share. Instead of buying the expensive camera equipment he'd always dreamed of, or upgrading his lifestyle, he'd established a foundation. The Caleb Andrus Foundation for Truth in Journalism provided grants to investigative reporters working on stories about corporate fraud and corruption. Sandra Morrison had been their first recipient, funding an investigation into pharmaceutical companies that was already making waves. Now, standing in the cave where it all began, Eli carefully placed the newspaper inside a waterproof container along with some of Caleb's original journals, the ones Caleb had decided to donate to journalistic history rather than keep private. He sealed the container and placed it on the stone shelf where he'd first discovered Caleb's secrets. Future hikers might find it someday, might wonder about the story it contained. But unlike Caleb's original cache, this one wasn't hidden in desperation or fear. It was a monument to the power of truth, and to the kind of courage that anyone could find if they looked hard enough. As he prepared to leave, Eli noticed something new near the cave entrance, a small rock cairn that hadn't been there before, with a piece of paper tucked beneath the top stone. He unfolded it and smiled. It was a check for $50,000, made out to the Eli Turner Wilderness Photography Fund. In the memo line, someone had written, "For seeing beauty in dark places." The signature at the bottom was elegant and confident. CA. But it was the return address on the envelope that made Eli laugh out loud. Caleb Woznanders lived in a small cabin outside Telluride now, had remarried a local teacher, and was working as a consultant helping the FBI investigate corporate fraud cases. He'd found his way back to the world, but on his own terms. 3 months later, Eli received a package in the mail. Inside was a leather-bound book with an elegant cover. The Lost Brother, a memoir by Caleb Andrus. A note was attached. Thought you might like to read the rest of the story? The first royalty check was quite generous. I think you'll be pleased with how I'm using it. Eli opened the book to the dedication page. T.T., who proved that some caves are meant to be explored, and some truths are worth telling, no matter how long they've been buried. He settled into his favorite reading chair and began to read, already knowing that this was one story with a truly happy ending.